In this lecture, we will introduce thinkers known as the Pre-Socratic philosophers. Historically, they were the thinkers who came before Socrates, whom we'll look at more in depth in a future lecture. The Pre-Socratics were thinkers from the 6th century BC up until the 5th century BC. Yes, BC, so they were really old. And so immediately this raises a question for us. Why would anyone bother looking at the pre-Socratic philosophers given that they were really old and lacked so many of our modern developments? It seems that there isn't much we could learn from these thinkers because of how advanced we are and how primitive their societies were in comparison. But there are actually 3 reasons why we should take them seriously. First, because they show us the transition from myth to rational inquiry. Second, because they actually anticipate many of our modern insights. And finally, because the purpose of studying philosophy is not to study a thinker as if we were observers looking into the life of such thinkers, because that is not philosophy. That is something more akin to history. Rather, we are interested in understanding what the philosophical life is and whether that is a life worth living. Since we wish to understand the philosophical life, we can examine the lives of the philosophers to understand the way they lived and the challenges they were willing to take on. And so in a previous lecture, we discussed the difference between myth and rational inquiry. We may recall that myth here does not mean fake, it means story. Poems are considered myths, but we would not say that a poem is false. Again, history is considered to be a myth, a kind of story. But from this, it does not follow that history is false. Myth is just an account of something, a telling or retelling of something in a literary way. But the philosopher does not want to hear a mere story. The philosopher wants to understand why the story is true. He wants to use his reason in order to determine whether the myth or story is actually true or false. The pre-Socratic philosophers were important for this shift. They had a desire to understand the world through reason and their own understanding, rather than through story. Think of it this way. We can share many stories about why things came to be. For example, we could say that the world was created out of chaos, or out of nothing, or even that the universe has always existed eternally. These 3 positions at least appear rational and not self-contradictory. Now, these 3 positions compared to each other are contradictory. The universe cannot be both created and not created, for example. So the question then is this: how do we know which account is correct? This was the problem the pre-Socratics saw. Their answer lies in this: we can know which accounts are true by using rational inquiry and thinking rather than story and myth. So the pre-Socratics try to rationally explain the universe. Looking at the pre-Socratics then, we'll notice 5 main movements. First, the Milesians. Second, Heraclitus's dynamic philosophy. Third, the Pythagoreans. Fourth, the Eleatics. And finally, the Atomists. What we will notice about these 5 main movements is that they are in conversation with one another. Not necessarily literally and physically in conversation, but the developments are always in reference to previous attempts at insight. We begin with the first group of pre-Socratic philosophers, known as the Milesians. They lived in the city of Miletus, located in Ionia, which is now modern-day Turkey. They are often considered the first philosophers in the Western tradition. What makes them the first philosophers is not that they were the first people to ask questions about the world, because people have always done that. Rather, they were the first to give non-mythic, rational explanations for the world around them. They wanted to understand the world by appealing to nature itself and not to divine stories. The Milesians were concerned with a very basic question. What is the fundamental stuff of the universe? In Greek, we call this the arche, or the first principle. So what is the first principle of the universe? The Milesians believed that if we could identify the one underlying substance from which everything else comes, then we could understand the world in a unified and rational way. This is the first attempt at what we might call a scientific theory of the universe. The first of the Milesians is Thales. Thales believed that the fundamental principle of all things was water. At first, this might sound strange to us, but Thales had reasons for this view. He noticed that all living things require water. He also observed that water can take on different forms. It can be a solid, like ice, a liquid, or a gas, like steam. So water seemed to be the most flexible and life-giving substance. From this, he concluded that everything ultimately comes from water. Thales also believed that the earth floats on water like a raft, and that the magnets have soul, so to speak, because they can move iron. Now, again, these ideas may sound odd, but what matters is not whether Thales was right, at least not for this lecture. What matters is that he was trying to explain the world without appealing to myth. He was trying to give a rational account of nature based on observation and reasoning, and that is a philosophical move. Now, even though we do not agree with Thales that water is the fundamental substance, the move he makes is exactly the move modern science makes: the search for a single underlying physical reality. Today, physicists talk about unified field theories, fundamental particles, and the idea that all matter is ultimately one kind of stuff arranged in a different way, or in a set of different ways. So while Thales' answer is not something we could consider to be true, at least we would not consider it true in our own day, his question and his method were astonishingly modern. Now, Thales had a student named Anaximander who disagreed with Thales. Anaximander argued that water could not be the fundamental principle because water is just one of the many elements. If water were the source of everything, then how could it produce its opposite, fire? Opposites cannot come from one another, he argued. So Anaximander proposed something more abstract: the unlimited or the indefinite. The unlimited or indefinite is not any particular element. It is a boundless, indeterminate substance that contains all the opposites within it. From the unlimited or the indefinite, the elements separate out, hot and cold, wet and dry, and then return to it in a kind of cosmic cycle. Anaximander even describes this process in moral language. The elements pay penalty to one another for their injustices. What he means is that nature maintains balance. When one element dominates too much, it is eventually corrected. Anaximander also believed that the Earth stays in place because it is equally distant from everything else. And this is an early intuition about equilibrium. He suggested that human beings originally came from fish-like creatures because human infants are too helpless to have survived on their own. Again, whether he was right is not the point. The point is that he is trying to explain the world through reason, not story. Like Thales, Anaximander is surprisingly close to modern thought in two ways. First, his idea that humans came from fish-like creatures is a kind of proto-evolutionary insight. It's not like Darwinian evolution, of course, but the same kind of reasoning seems to apply. Humans must have come from simpler, more self-sufficient organisms. Secondly, his idea of infinite, boundless substrate resembles modern concepts like space-time or quantum fields. His structure of thinking, then, seems to anticipate much of modern thought. So that's Anaximander. The third Milesian is Anaximenes, his name is a little hard to pronounce, Anaximenes, excuse me. So Anaximenes was a student of Anaximander. Anaximenes agreed that the arche, the beginning, the first principle, must be something simple and unified. But he thought that Anaximander's indefinite was too abstract. So he proposed something more concrete: air. Air, he argued, can become all the other elements through processes of condensation and rarefaction. When air condenses, it becomes wind, then cloud, then water, then earth. When it rarefies, it becomes fire. Anaximenes even offered a simple experiment. Breathe out with your mouth, and when you breathe out with your mouth open, and the air feels warm. Right? We do this when it's really cold outside. We breathe on our hands with our mouth open to warm our hands. Right? So when we do that, the air feels warm. But if we were to breathe out with our lips pursed, and the air will start to feel cold. So from this, Anaximenes concluded that changes in density produce changes in temperature and quality. This is the first attempt to explain qualitative differences in terms of quantitative changes, which again is a major step towards scientific thinking. Anaximenes' idea that changes in density produces different states of matter is again very close to what modern physicists teach. Today, we explain solids, liquids, and gases through phase transitions. These phase transitions depend on temperature, pressure, and density. So while his explanation is a bit primitive in comparison to modern science, his underlying idea that qualities emerge from quantitative physical changes is exactly how modern science works. He is the first thinker to reduce qualities to measurable physical processes. So after the Milesians, we turn to a very different kind of thinker, Heraclitus. If the Milesians were trying to explain the world by identifying a single underlying substance, Heraclitus believed that this entire approach was mistaken. For Heraclitus, the world is not fundamentally made of a thing at all. Instead, the world is fundamentally made of change. Everything is in motion. Everything is in flux. Nothing stays the same. Heraclitus is famous for saying that you cannot step into the same river twice. What he means by this is that the river is constantly flowing, constantly changing, and so are we. The world is not a stable object, but an ongoing process. Heraclitus believed that the basic reality of the universe is fire, not because everything is literally made of fire, but because fire is the element that best symbolizes constant transformation. Fire is always consuming, always changing, always moving. It is never still, yet it is still fire. For Heraclitus, change is not a problem to be solved. Change is the very nature of reality. In fact, he believed that conflict and tension are necessary for the world to exist. He says that war is the father of all things. And what he means by this is that opposites like hot and cold, wet and dry, are always in a kind of struggle, and the struggle is what produces harmony. So without tension, there would be no order. Without conflict, there would be no stability. Heraclitus sees the world as a dynamic balance of opposing forces. Heraclitus also believed in something he called the logos. The logos is the rational structure of the universe. It's the underlying order that governs all change. Even though everything is constantly changing, constantly shifting, there is still a pattern or a law or a reason behind it. So the logos is accessible to human beings because we share in reason. But the thing with Heraclitus is that he thinks most people fail to understand the logos because they are too distracted by appearances and too attached to their own opinions. So because of this, Heraclitus was very critical of society. He believed that most people live like they are asleep, unaware of the deeper order of things. He criticized democracy, religious rituals, and the way people chase after wealth and pleasure. So for Heraclitus then, the philosophical life is a life of waking up, of seeing the world as it truly is, and not as we wish it to be. Now, Heraclitus' view may sound poetic, but it is still very close to how modern science describes the world. Today, physicists tell us that matter is not a solid, unchanging substance. Instead, everything is made of fields, energy, and constant motion. At the atomic level, particles are always vibrating, interacting, and transforming. In biology, organisms are not static things, but they are an ongoing process. And we, in studying biology, witness this ongoing process. They are constantly exchanging matter and energy with their environment. And so, echoing Heraclitus' principles, modern physicists will tell us that even the stability of our bodies is really a dynamic equilibrium of countless chemical reactions happening every second. And so, in this sense, Heraclitus anticipated a worldview that sees reality not as a collection of fixed objects, but as a network of processes. Modern physics, thermodynamics, and even modern politics and philosophy often describe the world in ways that sound very Heraclitean. So while Heraclitus lived over 2,500 years ago, his insight that everything flows is very close to how we conceive things in our own day. After Heraclitus, we turn to another group of thinkers who take a very different approach to understanding the world, the Pythagoreans. While Heraclitus believed that the world is fundamentally made of change, the Pythagoreans believed that the world is fundamentally made of number. For them, the key to understanding reality is not found in a physical substance like water or air, nor in the constant flux of fire. Rather, for them, the key to understanding reality is found in the mathematical structure that underlies everything. The Pythagoreans were followers of Pythagoras. Pythagoras was a figure who is a philosopher and a mathematician, and also in a way, a religious leader. Pythagoras himself left no writings, and so what we know comes from his followers. But what is clear is that the Pythagoreans believed that mathematics reveals the true nature of the universe. They discovered that musical harmony is based on simple numerical ratios. So, for example, the octave corresponds to a 1-to-2 ratio, the fifth to a 2-to-3 ratio, and the fourth to a 3-to-4 ratio. This is why when we study music theory, we are really studying mathematics. Now, in the Pythagoreans' view, numbers were not just tools for counting. Numbers are the very structure of reality. They believe that everything, from the movements of the planets to the behavior of the soul, could be understood through mathematical patterns. They even had a sacred symbol, which they called the tetratrix, and a tetractus is a triangular arrangement of the numbers 1 through 10, which they believed represented the harmony and order of the cosmos. Finally, the Pythagoreans believed that the soul is immortal. They argued that if mathematical truths are not physical things, and we can know them, then there is something in us that is not physical, the soul. And since the soul is not physical, it cannot perish and just poof out of existence. Matter is the basis of change, but a non-material thing like the soul cannot change. Now, the Pythagoreans also practiced strict rules of life. This included, say, dietary restrictions and communal living. They did this because they believed that living in harmony with the mathematical order of the universe required both discipline and purification. And so in this way, then, they saw that philosophy was not just an intellectual pursuit, but it was a way of life. it was a way of life where we can put into practice that discipline and purification. Now, while some of their religious practices may seem pretty unusual to us, their central insight that the universe is structured mathematically is one of the most important ideas in the history of thought. The Pythagoreans were the first to argue that reality is intelligible because reality is mathematical. Again, this view is very close to how modern science understands the world. Today, physicists describe nature using mathematical equations. The laws of motion, the structure of atoms, and the behavior of light, and even the shape of the universe are all expressed in mathematical form by scientists. Even Galileo famously said that the book of nature, so the world around us, is written in the language of mathematics. This is essentially a Pythagorean idea. Modern physics, from quantum mechanics to general relativity, assumes that the universe is governed by precise mathematical relationships. And so while the Pythagoreans lived over 2,500 years ago, their belief that all is number remains one of the most influential ideas in both science and philosophy. And so after the Pythagoreans, we turn to a group of thinkers who challenge almost everything that came before them. The Eleatics. If the Milesians believed the world is made of a fundamental substance, and Heraclitus believed the world is made of change, and the Pythagoreans believed the world is made of number, the Eleatics argued that all of these views are mistaken. For the Eleatics, the world is not made of water or fire or numbers or change. Instead, the world is fundamentally one, unchanging, and eternal. The founder of the school is Parmenides, and he is one of the most radical thinkers in the history of philosophy. Now, how is this? Well, Parmenides begins with a very simple idea. Being is, and non-being is not. And at first, this sounds pretty obvious. Yeah, being is and non-being is not. But Parmenides uses this idea to argue that change is impossible. Why? Because change would require something to come into being from non-being, from nothing. But nothing cannot cause anything. Nothing cannot be the source of something. So if change requires something to come from nothing, then that means change is impossible. Parmenides also argues that motion is impossible. If something moves, it must move into a place where it is not. But if it is not there, then that place is non-being. And since non-being does not exist, there is nowhere for anything to move. And so he would say motion is impossible. And so from these arguments, Parmenides concludes that reality must be one, continuous, indivisible, and unchanging. He describes reality as a kind of perfect sphere, not literally a sphere, but symbolically. It's something that is whole, complete, without gaps, without change. According to Parmenides, all the change that we see around us, like birth, death, growth, and decay, is actually an illusion. It's a sign that our senses deceive us, and that only reason can reveal the truth. Now, this view is obviously very strange. It goes against everything we experience. But Parmenides is not trying to be difficult. He is trying to show that if we follow reason strictly, we end up with a picture of reality that is very different from what our senses tell us. And this forces us to ask a deep question. Should we trust our senses or our reason? To defend Parmenides' view, his student Zeno created a series of famous paradoxes. The most well-known is the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise. Achilles gives a tortoise a head start in a race. And so Zeno argues that Achilles can actually never catch up with the tortoise. This is because by the time Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, since the tortoise had a head start, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead. And by the time Achilles reaches that point, the tortoise has already moved again. And this series continues on for infinity. So Achilles can never catch up with the tortoise. That's the argument Zeno gives. So Zeno's goal here is not to confuse us. Again, his goal is to show that our ordinary belief in motion leads to contradictions. If motion leads to contradictions, then motion must be impossible, just as Parmenides argued. Now, as strange as Parmenides' view may sound, it has surprising connections to modern science. In modern physics, for example, especially in, say, Einstein's theory of relativity, time is treated as a dimension, just like space. Past, present, and future all exist together in what physicists call the block universe. In this view, the universe is a four-dimensional structure that does not change in the way we normally think. All events, past and future, here are equally real. And this is remarkably close to Parmenides' idea that reality is one unchanging and whole. Again, Zeno's paradox, and his other paradoxes, I should say, also anticipate modern mathematics. The paradoxes that he offers us forces us to think about infinite series, limits, and the nature of continuity. It was not until really the development of calculus, so a little over 2,000 years later from Zeno's time period, that mathematicians could fully resolve Zeno's paradox and his other set of paradoxes. And even today, Zeno's ideas appear in discussions of quantum mechanics, where motion at the smallest scales behaves in strange and in really counterintuitive ways. And so, while Parmenides and Zeno may seem extreme, their arguments have shaped the entire history of philosophy and science. They force us to confront the deepest questions about reality, such as, is change real? Or is motion real? And can we trust our senses? Or is the world something very different from what it appears to be? So after the Eleatics, we turn to the final group of pre-Socratic thinkers that we will look at. These are the atomists. The atomists are important because they are trying to solve a problem created by Parmenides. Remember, Parmenides argued that change is impossible because something cannot come from nothing. If change requires something to come into being from non-being, then change cannot happen. But the atomists want to preserve the reality of change while still taking Parmenides' argument seriously. So their solution is one of the most influential ideas in the history of philosophy and science. The atomists argue that the world is made of two things: atoms and the void. Atoms for them are tiny, indivisible, eternal pieces of really what is. They are solid, unchanging, and indestructible. They differ only in shape, size, and arrangement. Now, the void, on the other hand, is what is not. It's empty space. But unlike Parmenides, the atomists argued that the void exists. Without empty space, atoms could not move. And if atoms could not move, then change would be impossible. And so the atomists agree with Parmenides that what is cannot come from what is not. Atoms never come into being and atoms never come into being and never perish. But they disagree with Parmenides about the void. The atomists argue that empty space is real, and because of this, atoms can move and collide and combine and separate. And so all change then is not creation from nothing. It is simply the rearrangement of eternal atoms in the void. This allows the atomists to explain everything, from the formation of worlds to the qualities of objects, through the shapes and motions of atoms. For example, They believe that sweet things are made of smooth atoms, while bitter things are made of sharp atoms that cut the tongue. Again, this is not correct by modern standards, of course, but the important point is that they are giving a mechanistic explanation of the world. They are trying to explain qualities in terms of physical structure and motion. The atomists also believed that the soul is made of very fine, fast-moving atoms. When the body dies, these atoms disperse. And so, unlike the Pythagoreans, the atomists do not believe in the immortality of the soul. For them, everything, including the soul, is ultimately physical. And again, the atomists are astonishingly close to modern science. Their basic idea, that the world is made of tiny, indivisible particles moving in empty space, is the foundation of modern atomic theory. Now, of course, our atoms are not exactly the same as theirs, or at least our conception of atoms. We now know, for example, that atoms can be divided into protons, neutrons, and electrons, and even those have some subatomic structure. But the core insight is the same. The physical world is composed of fundamental particles whose interactions explain the phenomena we observe, the change we observe, and really the world that we sense. And so the atomists anticipate the modern idea of science. We see this again with the example of qualities like taste, color, and texture, and how qualities are not fundamental features of reality, but arise from the arrangement and motion of particles. Again, this is very close to how physics and chemistry describe the world today. And their belief that the soul is physical anticipates modern neuroscience, which explains mental activity in terms of physical processes in the brain. And so, while the atomists lived over 2,400 years ago, their worldview is again remarkably modern. In many ways, they are closer to contemporary science than many of the later thinkers may have been. So their attempt to save change from Parmenides by appealing to atoms and the void is one of the most important moves in the history of philosophy. And so looking at the Pre-Socratics as a whole, we can see that they were not simply guessing about the world. They were trying to understand reality through reason rather than myth. They asked questions that are still with us today. What is the world made of? And how does change occur? And can we trust our senses? And what is the nature of the soul? And what is the structure of reality? So we saw 5 major movements. The Milesians, who searched for a single underlying substance. Heraclitus, who argued that the world is fundamentally made of change. The Pythagoreans, who believed that the universe is structured by number. The Eleatics, who denied the reality of change altogether. And finally, the atomists, who tried to reconcile change with reason by appealing to atoms and the void. And what is remarkable of this is that many of these ancient thinkers, again, anticipate modern science and philosophy. The Milesians' search for a unified substance resembles modern physics. Heraclitus' emphasis on flux echoes thermodynamics, and process theory. The Pythagoreans' belief in mathematical structure is ultimately the foundation of modern science. Parmenides' unchanging reality resembles the block universe of relativity. And finally, the atomists' view of particles and the void anticipate much of atomic theory. So even though the Pre-Socratics lived thousands of years ago, their questions and insights remain deeply relevant. They show us that old does not mean false. If their views were false, the Pre-Socratics, then most of what we know in our own day would have to be considered false, just because of how much we rely on their insights. And most importantly, the Pre-Socratics remind us that the philosophical life is not just about learning what others have said and what others have thought. The philosophical life is about learning how to live with wonder. It is ultimately wonder that will change your mere life into an examined life. So I hope this was helpful. Thank you.